Kevin Stanley.
Hey, a little less conversation, a little more action. All this aggravation ain't satisfaction in me. A little more fight, a little less spark. A little less fight, a little more spark. Close your mouth and open up your heart. It'll satisfy me. Satisfy me, baby. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CBRE's 15th annual Melbourne Market Outlook Breakfast. It's a great pleasure and somewhat of a relief to see so many GFC survivors in the room this morning. And to any of you under 35 who weren't around in the early 90s, may I bid you a very warm welcome to the club. Early on in 2010, there's an audible buzz in our industry. Activity levels are up across the board, confidence seems to be up, and we wonder whether or not that means that we are in fact at the beginning of an upswing, or is there a double dip ahead of us? The man who intends to perhaps wrap some logic around those questions and take some of the emotion out of them is Kevin Stanley, and would you please welcome him for this morning's presentation.
Okay, well, good morning to the Melbourne Market Outlook 2010. This morning's outlook will be quite different from the previous events that we've held here in Melbourne for actually 15 years now. This morning's presentation will be much more relaxed, much more laid back, free-flowing. And I guess the other thing about the presentation this morning is that the outlook itself is actually very different, and it's very different to what we said just 12 months ago. The markets have certainly turned around faster than we expected. We think we're really poised for quite an exciting year. It really sets the context for the material we'll present this morning. There's three sections we want to step you through during the next hour or so. First, we want to talk about the context, I guess more broadly about the globe and Australia and here in Victoria and Melbourne. Then we want to move through each of the sectors as we typically do, but in quite a different format. We're going to have a research outlook and then followed by a conversation with some of the professionals from our office here in Melbourne. And we'll finish up with some conclusions and directions for the year ahead. So, the context. Ray Chordow, our global chief economist, says things are looking better. That's to use his words. Global economies are starting to move again. It's in an early phase of a long recovery process. The US, UK, Germany and even Japan are starting to move their economies forward a little now, and that critical mass and that momentum should be enough, we believe, to see that there isn't a double dip during 2010. I know there's a lot of concern still about the potential for that. We do think that financial markets will remain volatile, but the real economy is starting to gather some momentum now. And once that happens, we think the chance of a double dip is much less likely. This chart shows you what's been happening in the world GDP scene in our forecast. Our assumption is that world growth will contract by 2% in 2009. That, of course, is still a forecast, before moving to about 2.5% positive growth this year. That's a pretty quick turnaround. That's about a 4% change, of course, from the negative to the positive. But it's really brought about by some synchronised efforts globally to kickstart the global economy. Here in Australia, of course, no recession, but we assume that growth overall in the country will pick up to about the same rate as the global economy, about 2.5% in 2010. But perhaps the biggest surprise is Victoria, and our assumptions here are that the turnaround will be much greater than Australia overall. In fact, growth in Victoria will lead the nation, and of course 2009, not a recession here either. By 2011, the cycle will be more sustained and more typical. But a couple of things stand out when you look in behind these numbers. One is that the employment growth in, especially the white-collar employment growth in Victoria, is scheduled to be the highest in the country over the next 3 years. And I think that's a very important point for the property markets and the recovery in the property markets. The other point is too, over the next 3 to 5 years, if you actually rank the growth across the states and territories of Australia, Victoria is right up there in third position, just behind what we expect will be strongly rebounding economies in Western Australia and Queensland. So for Victoria not to be a resources state, yet to be right up there with those guys is a terrific effort, and that's a major part of our forecast. So here we are at the turning point of the decades. 2010. If we look back for a moment, that's something we don't do a lot of at CB Richard Ellis, but over the last 10 years, when you look at the growth that's actually occurred in Victoria, it really is quite extraordinary. And we've seen 40% growth in retail turnover in that time. We've seen room nights occupied in the tourism sector grow over 30%. The total economy overall has grown over 30%. White collar employment over 25%. The population has grown over 10% in 10 years. The only sector that really has struggled in the last 10 years, if you look at the underlying drivers in behind real estate, has been industrial production, meaning really manufacturing, as it's continued to move offshore and be replaced in many cases by a booming logistics sector as imports come in from China. So it really places Victoria with this, the overriding question in some ways is the theme for the total presentation, and that is, can Victoria and Melbourne return to these levels of growth over the next 10 years? It's not going to be easy because growth needs to be funded. It needs to be provided with infrastructure. It needs property development to provide for new jobs and new houses. It's not going to be easy, but we think Victoria can do it. And certainly the forecasts suggest that the next 10 years, the overall growth will actually be quite similar to the last 10 years. Just think about what's happened in the last 10 years. The forecasts that we rely on suggest that the economy will grow again by another 30% in the next 10 years. Some factors will start to reduce over the next 10 years. Retail turnover has probably come through an unsustainable level, I would suggest, in the last 10 years, and will be returning to some more regular levels in the next 10. Excuse me. White collar employment may also ease back over the next 10 years as the baby boomers start to retire, and that impact is more significant. For the population, look at that. The forecast and what's being planned for in this state is for a 20% increase of the base that currently exists. So overall, still some very significant forecasts for growth are in the numbers, are being planned for in Victoria. But of course, some constraints and risks remain, especially coming out of what could have been such a massive downturn globally. I guess the question that's still on our mind are when will the debt markets fully open? And our assumption really is that it's going to be a very gradual process in this country and indeed around the world, and that may constrain some investment and development activities still. Will there be a double dip? Well, our view is it's much less likely now, put it that way. Will capacity constraints lead to higher inflation? I suspect that when we're here this time next year, the unemployment rate's going to be tight again. We're going to be back to exactly where we were just a couple of years ago. Very tight property markets, very tight economy, and there will be upward pressures on inflation. And that's going to challenge Melbourne's affordability advantage. There's no question that the cost of doing business in Melbourne and Victoria is much less still than other parts of the country, and that's actually helped grow this property market and grow the economy. So there's still some challenges ahead, but let's move now into the property markets and look in a bit more detail, starting with the CBD office market. Okay, investment activity has fallen in Melbourne CBD, although, as you can see on this chart, Melbourne CBD office market represented about 22% of all trading activity in the CBD office sector across the country last year. This is a very typical pattern. Investment activity has really hit the bottom of the trading activity, and it's been pretty settled in around 2008 and 2009 at about $400 million. We think confidence is returning now, and once we start to see some deals done early this year, we suspect there will be an increase in investment activity of deals completed during 2010.